Hello and welcome to the Balanced Approach podcast with your host, me, Louis Padian. These podcasts are released every week, so be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to be kept up to date. Hello and welcome to episode 129 of the Balanced Approach podcast with me, Louis Padian. Today we will be discussing why tracking works, and it's something that I often speak to people about or speak to clients about, and actually I think we miss a lot of key points. People have a lot of misconceptions around why we use tracking and how it has an impact, not necessarily just that it tells me everything you're eating and how you're moving and things like that. So for those of you who are new here, I'm Louis. I'm a online accredited nutritionist with the AFN. I'm a personal trainer, NHS health coach, and I've been coaching people for the last 10 plus years. And I help people lose weight and keep it off in the long term, which is the key important bit. So today, like I said, I want to talk about tracking, and that's stuff around food, that's around activity, around weight, sleep, lots of other healthy habits that we might want to promote, and why it changes the behavior and not necessarily how you think it does, and why you don't necessarily need to do it perfectly, and sometimes that's the point. So this isn't a episode of me saying that you need to track everything forever in order to be successful, because I don't believe that, and that isn't something that I do, that isn't something that my clients do, and I don't think that's the best way for everyone moving forward. I think it's a tool that we use, and this is something, if you've heard me speak before, I talk about tools in the toolbox, and tracking various metrics, various things, and different ways of tracking them are tools in the toolbox that we might use for certain jobs, and how that person's life is, what they're trying to achieve. We might use a different tool in a different toolbox for them. So this is about understanding how awareness matters, and some form of self-monitoring allows you to have some accountability and some independence, and that's actually what helps people make progress. Personally, I use self-monitoring, and there's a reason why, which we'll discuss in a minute, that even as a nutritionist, at times I will monitor my food intake. Even as a weight loss coach, at points I will monitor my weight, and those are really useful things that I'd actively encourage people to do. And there's different ways of doing those things as well. So let's jump into it. So the main reason that I do it and encourage people to do these things around tracking their weight, monitoring their food intake, monitoring their activities, is because we know those habits and behaviors are really useful in losing weight, but we're really useless at it. People aren't very good at remembering what we've eaten, taking an honest account of how much we've moved that week, and guesstimating our weight. We're pretty poor at it. And the data is really, really damning on this, that if we look at large nutrition surveys, people often misreport their food intake by underreporting by 25, 30. I've seen numbers up to 50%. And this is in particularly powerful or impactful in those who are overweight or obese. Those tend to underreport more in regards to their food. And people often tend to report healthier eating patterns than what's actually happening. People also underreport how active they are, and that tends to be more on the higher intensity exercise, or the higher levels of moderate to vigorous levels of activity per week. So, and this isn't because people are lying. This is because this is what people genuinely think, and our brains aren't picking up on every single minute of every single day. Actually, we're going on autopilot a lot of the time. So you tend to miss out on certain things. You tend to over exaggerate sort of the positive things that you've actually had to consciously make an effort for, like going for a walk, or like one meal throughout the week where you've made it extra healthy or nutritious. That tends to overshadow a lot of potentially and overpower the constant actions that are happening throughout the week. Those biscuits from the tin that you tend to replenish, but you don't really eat biscuits. This is something that me and my colleagues in the NHS discuss, that often people will genuinely tell us about, I eat quite well, I move quite a bit, but I can't get to the bottom of it. And then once we probe with a few questions and sort of ask them and challenge them on certain things, not from a judgmental standpoint, but from a curiosity to help them understand that this healthy eating pattern, potentially, that they might only have 1 to 2 portions of vegetables across a week, which is something that we probably would say that needs to improve. That would be helpful for their health, well-being, but also weight loss. Or their activity, they might see the one walk at the weekend, that they might go and do a 1 hour walk, for example, at low intensity. If actually I'm really active every week, but day to day they're sat down quite a lot. So I think it's really important, and this is how it plays a part in it. And the reason I said that, even as a nutritionist, sometimes I will monitor my food and activity and my weight, is I've struggled with my weight in the past,
And also, nutritionists get it wrong. A lot of the research reports show that we're more accurate than the average person, but we're still not perfect. So having that awareness and bringing those tools back in, especially if I've got sort of a goal that I'm trying to achieve, like losing weight, for example, or trying to get stronger, I will track metrics because we're not very good at taking a non-biased view of it. We sort of, like I said, overestimate how active we are and underestimate sort of our calorie intake, and then we get frustrated because the numbers don't quite add up. So, how does monitoring actually shift behavior? So, when I'm sitting down with a patient or a client, we'll discuss food diaries, we'll discuss steps, activity, and again, it's working with that individual. So, some of these things might not work for certain people. They might have had bad experience in the past, or might be really, really good at certain things and have really good success. So, we might lean into those a little bit more. But it's a really useful tool for us to get a overall idea of things that are happening. But also, the research supports that people who self-monitor, who monitor things like their activity, their food intake, and their body weight and things like that, get better results long term. So, weight loss trials show that people who consistently track their food, physical activity, and weight are more likely to hit at least that 5% clinical mark that we're trying to hit, where we get the majority of health benefits, which means that they are more likely to get the positive health changes that they're chasing. Research around digital tools, so if we're looking at calorie tracking apps, we're looking at activity watches and things, they improve people's adherence. So, for example, if I had to sit down and write down how many steps I'm doing each day, that'd be really difficult for me to imagine or get an accurate estimation of. I might have certain things that I might pull upon where I go, well, for this time, I have a rough idea, but pretty wouldn't be very accurate if I'm honest. So having something that automatically does it for you, like an activity watch, something that tracks your sleep, like potentially another activity watch, or monitoring your food quite while you're there and then, and getting a rough estimation on calories, for example, can improve people's adherence and again makes them more effective at losing weight and managing their health long term. Another study showed that frequent self-monitoring of diet, activity, and weight was directly associated with more weight loss long term. So I think us looking at these metrics and saying more frequent doesn't mean all the time. So might use a golden rule of thumb of 80 to 90%, as long as that 20 and 10% is you're being fairly sensible with, then you can still make really, really good progress with not monitoring everything. And we'll talk about how that might look for different people and there's different levels. And seeing things as a dial that you turn up and down is really useful rather than an on and off switch, which people tend to think. Whether they are tracking their calories, they tend to think, well, I need to track every single lick and bite, which can be really useful, or every single meal all the time. Actually, over time, you tend to find that what level of tracking gets you the results that you want. You know, only need to be as accurate as the results that you want. So, for example, me personally, if I was tracking calories, I probably wouldn't track my soft drinks. I tend to have 0 calorie drinks if I'm having those. I'll track my coffees if I'm having those, but I tend to have a skimmed milk in them if I'm trying to be mindful around my calorie intake. I wouldn't track squash and things like that. I probably would track fruit because I tend to have a lot of fruit throughout the day. So those calories can quickly stack up. But for some condiments, I might not track them at all because the hassle of tracking them actually isn't worthwhile. And I know when I track my calories that if I'm going through a fat loss phase, then I might track the majority of my food throughout the day. But if we're having a home cooked prep meal in the evening, we'll make some sensible decisions around trying to reduce the saturated fat content in it, try and get a good amount of fruit and veg, have a look at what that plate looks like, and have a rough guess and keep those calories sort of almost like banked and go, right, my evening meal, I've got 600 calories, 700 calories, roughly. That's what that looks like. And I'm not going to track it, but I know that's what makes the numbers. As long as I'm making progress, that's fine. But if I'm not making progress, then I might have to tighten things up a little bit. So it's about finding that level for you, which we'll discuss in a second. But the reason that tracking works is that you become more aware of those invisible calories, those moments that you don't remember, those bites, licks, tastes, those little second helpings that you might have the weekend. Because normally you're not noticing them, but if you're logging them, you have to think about that. And during that moment, I'd sort of, depending on where someone is on their logging or monitoring, self-monitoring journey, this is something that I'd encourage people to do and become fairly consistent with for maybe a week or so and see what they learn. This is what I mean when it's not necessarily just about me knowing what food they eat. It's actually raising their awareness about what calories are in what foods potentially, what foods fill them up more for less calories, or how certain foods that have higher fiber volume, that like fruits and vegetables can take up a lot of space on a plate for not much calories. And actually, that's a really good way to bulk out your meal visually and actually feel a bit fuller, whilst also being mindful of your portion sizes. Same with step counts. People tend to think that they're fairly active, but what does fairly active mean to that person? That could mean very different things for very different people. For some patients or clients that I speak to, that might be 2,000-3,000 steps a day. For other people, that might be 16,000-17,000 steps a day. And those people both say, well, I'm fairly active. Well, the energy expenditure on both of those would be completely different. So getting a good idea through monitoring through steps, or there's apps like Active 10, which I think is through the British Heart Foundation, which is an app on your phone that will help you monitor even just a pedometer to see what number of steps you're doing throughout the day. Roughly, they're inaccurate, but they're consistently inaccurate. So having that consistency of data, whether it's right or wrong, shows us days where you're more active or less active. Same with the weighing scales as well. This is something that we know from the National Weight Control Registry, which is what a cohort of people who have successfully lost a significant amount of weight and kept it off long term. They looked at their habits and behaviors, and we know regular sort of self-monitoring of their weight, with their clothes, those sorts of things. Not every day, but every now and then helps one, they maintain where they're currently at. But if they notice a trend of things creeping upwards, they catch it earlier rather than 3-6 months down the line where they've suddenly gained 25-50% of that weight back, and that's a lot harder to pull back in. And that's where, if we actively monitor these things, we can dial things up and dial things down depending on what we want to happen. So if I see my weight creeping up, then I go, actually, maybe I need to start monitoring my portion control a little bit more on my calories. Maybe I need to monitor my activity levels as well. And then I'll keep an eye on my weight for a couple of weeks, bring back down to a range that feels better for me. Then, well, then I can pull things out again and look at that maintaining and have a bit more flexibility. You don't need to be perfect with all these things. It's just about seeing it as feedback, getting as best feedback as we can, having a look at the overall trends without judgment, and going, right, what variables can I control here and what can I change to help get the results that I want? So, as I said, different levels of tracking. So we might see these as 3 levels that we dial up and dial down. And it might be best off starting with level 3 first of all, which is probably what people think most of when I mention about self-monitoring or tracking. And that's where we might be a bit more stringent with it. We might track pretty much everything that goes into our mouth. We might monitor all our steps all the time. We might monitor our sleep every night just to get that data, that bulk in. And we don't have to do it forever, but it could be for a couple of weeks. And that will give us a good overall picture of things that are happening. And the reason that we're doing this is that if we are trying to lose weight, getting those variables and going, right, are these things contributing to our weight loss or our weight gain, or are they neutral? Most of the things that we'll monitor will have some form of contribution. So with food, activity, and sleep, for example, we might have measurements in there as well. We might have fruit and veg portions, we might have protein portions, all these things that we might monitor over time, and we get to pick and choose which ones we do. We don't want to do them all at once because that's quite overwhelming. So we might pick and choose which ones might be best or most appropriate for you in that instance. And we'll go, right, so we know that we're sleeping this much, we're moving this much, we're eating this much, our weight's trending down. Brilliant. So that's moving in the right direction from where we want it to be. So if we keep doing these things, get to the place that we want to be, then we can look at that maintenance phase. So we might try and actually track those metrics and maintain our weight. So what does your activity levels look to maintain your weight? What does your food intake look like to maintain your weight? And then looking at that and going, right, so let's dial these down. So this is level 3 at the moment, we're tracking everything. So then we might dial it down to level 2, which might be just tracking calories. We're not going to track protein, we're not going to track fruit and veg. We might track calories just for 3 or 4 days a week and try to be consistent with the other days. So we're not tracking on those other 3 or 4 days a week, but we are still being mindful of our food portions. We might have a look at what our plate looks like, where we're trying to get 50% fruits and vegetables on there, or like leafy greens and things, quarter lean protein sources, quarter starch carbohydrates, maybe some input of polyunsaturated fats in there. But that's sort of like a good meal to work from. And we know roughly when I'm tracking calories, I have this for breakfast and it's this many calories, right? On days we're not tracking, we'll have a pretty similar thing, similar portion size, but we're not going to track it. Okay, so it takes away that level of effort. And if we can build that, it's almost practicing that maintenance phase that we're looking for long term of roughly we'll have this, this, and this. My weight maintains. Fantastic. Level 1 might be for people who are potentially a bit overwhelmed, feel anxious about numbers in particular, who have had really bad instances in the past where people have been on really restrictive diets and got obsessed with numbers. So we might not do that because that might lead into those unhelpful behaviors that they've had in the past. So we might use a photo food diary, for example, or just a handwritten diary where they're not looking at calories, but this is what I had and this roughly what the portions were. Measuring activities by, like I said, an active 10 by minutes, or just a handwritten diary of these are the activities that I've done today, because, for example, someone might have a fairly active day job, so we're not going to monitor their steps during that because that's going to stay fairly consistent, especially across 5 days of the week, roughly, on the whole. But what are the additional bits that we're going to monitor? So we might went for a 20-minute walk 3 times this week, so Monday, Wednesday, Friday, after work, brilliant. We know roughly that's the input level of activity. That's the impact it's having on their weight, for example, or might just be we're not tracking numerics on the weighing scales. We might track how clothes fit. Might do progress photos where they're wearing the same clothes each week and just seeing how they go. They might have a look at if we're trying to measure their energy levels, their well-being, their relationship food, all these things that we can measure. And it's about picking the right thing for that individual at that moment in time. Like I said, the goal of this is awareness. Yes, the numbers are helpful, but you just practicing being mindful around your food, you just practicing being mindful around your activity levels will improve those areas, will budge them towards where you want them to be. So necessarily doesn't really matter about the number, as long as we're consistently monitoring it, then it just helps us with that awareness and we can see where the trends are going. So when it can be unhelpful. So again, this is where I might sit down with someone who, like I said, might have a really restrictive might have a history of disordered eating in the past, and tracking can be really, really triggering for them, where they can slip back into unhelpful old behaviors that they're trying to avoid. And I think that's the best way to do. So if we're doing that, then I'm not going to say, well, you must track. I do think tracking is a really useful tool, but it's not for everyone. So if you feel panicky and you can't, for example, you can't log a meal and you get worried, anxious, you try and hit every single metric on there. So this is where macros can be really unhelpful for people, that they hit the exact grams of fats, carbs, protein, which doesn't really need to happen. Actually, we can have a bit more flexibility in there. It would be beneficial for a lot of people to have a lot more flexibility. Or if people really ignore their hunger or fullness and just see it as a calories in, calories out, there's a lot more to it. Those numbers are important, but it's seeing past that and seeing and using it as a learning tool. In those cases, we probably would just go back to level 1 where we're not really monitoring that much. We might do like a food handwritten diary, not necessarily measuring the calories or food, or getting a food photo diary. Probably wouldn't be looking to lose weight in that instance, potentially, especially if they are in the middle of sort of an episode where they're overly restrictive, and in that we might pull them back and go, actually, we want to practice maintenance for a bit. We'd focus on healthy behaviors. So, like I said, fruits, vegetables, lean protein sources, maybe some other mindfulness techniques and self-care. And we'd probably try and work on their relationship with food before leaning on sort of tracking again and getting them to a position where they have a really positive relationship with food. So we're dieting from a position of strength rather than feeling that we need it in order to fix everything, because it will paint over the cracks for a while, but as soon as you pull that tracking element away, then people tend to really, really struggle. So just to summarize with tracking, hopefully this has been an informative episode and give you a bit of food for thought on why I mentioned self-monitoring and tracking quite a bit. Most of us, if not all of us, are really poor at knowing how much we're eating, knowing how much we're moving, monitoring our weight long term. So that includes me as nutritionists and dietitians when we've looked at those. So having some form of external way to monitor that, or some monitoring tools to help us raise awareness, is really useful. Self-monitoring in some form is one of the strongest predictors of weight loss and health, and bettering health. What gets measured gets managed is a really useful tool. So if we can find a way to measure it, and that doesn't necessarily mean tracking calories all the time. For example, it could be, for the question, instead of me going, how many calories have you eaten, is going, have you eaten to a comfortable level of fullness throughout the day? And the options could be all the time, most of the time, some of the time, none of the time. We're aiming for most of the time. Brilliant. That's more often than not. That's what we're aiming for. If people are nailing all the time, then that might be a bit worrying as well, because they might be getting obsessive in that thing. So again, having that human element is really important. Key message that I want you to take away is self-monitoring and tracking isn't about perfection. It's about you raising that awareness. It's not a way to beat yourself up if you don't hit the numbers, or a stick to beat yourself with. It's not there for punishment. It's just about getting honest feedback and allowing you to make better decisions moving forward, so you're able to continue with your progress, all the bumps in the road, and make that meaningful progress and maintain it long term. So losing that weight and maintaining it. And if you are struggling and you really want help and support moving forward, and help with building that accountability and finding a way that definitely works for you, then DM me the word support and we can talk about how potentially online one-to-one coaching could work for you. Thank you very much for listening to today's episode of the Balanced Approach podcast. These episodes are released every week, so wherever you're listening, just hit subscribe and you'll get a notification every time it comes out. But thank you very much, and I look forward to catching you on the next episode.